We are accustomed to thinking that nighttime is a time of legitimate rest for everyone. It seems natural to us that when darkness falls, the world quietens down and the working day ends. However, in the huge mansions of the Victorian era, nighttime became the most intense and frightening shift. While the owners of the house slept in their warm beds, a completely different life unfolded behind the walls of their bedrooms, full of danger and fear. In the corridors, lit by the dim light of candles, people fought fatigue to make the house look impeccable by morning. Watch the video to the end to find out why servants feared the silence of the night more than the wrath of their masters, and what deadly threat lurked in ordinary gas lamps. Are you ready to learn the truth about people who became ghosts while still alive? The most important rule for any night servant was to be completely and utterly invisible to the owners of the house. The servant was not allowed to make a single sound that could disturb the sleep of their masters. This created an atmosphere of constant nervous tension that never let up for a moment. People moved around the house like shadows, trying not to creak the floorboards or bump into the furniture. Every step down the hallway was calibrated by years of practice and the fear of immediate dismissal. Shoes were often removed or wrapped in cloth to make footsteps completely silent. In the huge empty halls, any rustle echoed, amplified many times over in the silence. The servants learned to breathe quietly, even when carrying heavy baskets of coal or water. This unnatural behavior turned their work into a strange, silent dance. Night cleaning of living rooms and offices required special skill and caution. It was necessary to wipe fragile vases and figurines by touch in the dim light. One awkward movement could cost a person a year's salary and their job. Dust was wiped slowly so that it would not rise into the air and cause sneezing. Coughing or sneezing had to be suppressed with all one's might, to the point of tears in the eyes. Cleaning the fireplaces was a particular challenge, as it was done exclusively at night or in the early hours of the morning. The cooled ashes had to be raked out so that they did not scatter around the room. The soot ate into the skin, and washing it off in cold water was a real problem. Blackening cast iron grates required physical strength, but it had to be done without making any noise. Metal scrapers against stone would make a terrible sound, so rags and brushes were used instead. Servants often worked on their knees, crawling on cold stone or parquet floors. From standing on their knees for long periods of time, their joints swelled and ached, but there was no one to complain to. The cold penetrated their thin clothing, restricting their movements and making their fingers clumsy. But even with frozen hands, they had to perform the delicate work of polishing furniture. In the darkness, their senses were heightened, and every object seemed hostile. The psychological pressure was compounded by the strictest prohibition on being seen by the owners if they suddenly woke up. If the owner left the bedroom, the servant was obliged to disappear instantly or turn away to face the wall. This rule was hammered into their heads from the first day of service and became a reflex. People ceased to feel like individuals, turning into functions, faceless instruments of comfort. The night only emphasized this loneliness and detachment from the normal world. Servants who worked at night often did not see daylight for weeks, especially in winter. Their world narrowed to a spot of light from a candle stub or a dim lamp. This affected their eyesight, which quickly deteriorated from constant strain. Their eyes watered and reddened, but they could not interrupt their work. The darkness outside the windows became a constant companion in their lives. Life went on behind closed doors, but the servants were cut off from it by thick walls. They could only guess what was happening from sounds or fragments of phrases. This created a feeling of complete isolation, as if they were on a desert island. Their only companions were their own thoughts and fears. The silence in the house weighed heavily on their ears, causing ringing and hallucinations. Fatigue accumulated, turning into a chronic state of exhaustion. At night, the body demanded sleep, and fighting sleep became a painful torture. People pinched themselves and washed their faces with ice-cold water just to keep their eyes open. Falling asleep on duty meant immediate disgrace and expulsion to the street. Fear of the future was a better stimulant than the strongest coffee. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about a job where the main requirement was to become invisible in your own home? Write about it in the comments. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the comfort of old houses? The lighting in Victorian homes that we see in movies was actually a source of constant mortal danger. The gas lamps that provided light consumed enormous amounts of oxygen. In rooms closed at night, the air quickly became stuffy and heavy. Servants who worked under such lighting constantly suffered from headaches and nausea. The gas at that time was unpurified and contained many harmful impurities, including sulfur. When burned, it released corrosive substances that settled on the lungs and damaged furniture. Black soot covered the ceilings and walls, and it was the servants who had to clean it up. But the worst thing was that the flame could go out unnoticed. A gas leak in an enclosed space threatened an explosion or a quiet death in one's sleep. The pipes that supplied the gas were often homemade and leaked poisonous fumes. The servants were the first to smell the characteristic odor, but they could not always find the source of the leak. They had to inspect kilometers of pipes with open flames, which was madness. Any spark in a gas-filled basement could destroy half the house. Fear of invisible gas was a constant companion during night shifts. In addition to gas, oil lamps were used, which required complex and dirty maintenance. The wicks had to be cut perfectly straight, otherwise the lamp would start to smoke. Oil was often spilled, creating a fire hazard on wooden floors. The hot glass of the lamps burned fingers roughened by hard work. The smell of burnt oil permeated clothing and hair, following people everywhere. The candles given to the servants were of the lowest quality and made from animal fat. They gave off very little light but smoked mercilessly. The fat dripped onto hands and clothes, forming an unpleasant crust. To save money, servants were often forbidden to light more than one candle. With such poor lighting, they had to perform work that required attention to detail. Carrying light sources up huge staircases was an art form in itself. The maids' long skirts and drafts created ideal conditions for fire. One wrong move, and the hem of a dress could burst into flames in seconds. There were no fire extinguishers in the dark corridors, only heavy carpets or water in jugs. Fire was every resident's nightmare. The shadows cast by the gas light were sharp and shifting, frightening tired people. In the flickering light of the flames, ordinary objects took on sinister shapes. This created an oppressive atmosphere that weighed heavily on the psyche of the lonely worker. It seemed as if someone was hiding in the corners of the rooms, watching every movement. The nervous tension caused by the play of light and shadow was no less exhausting than physical labor. The gas lamps emitted a constant, monotonous noise, like the hissing of a snake. This sound in the complete silence of the nighttime house was unnerving. It made it difficult to concentrate and created the illusion of someone whispering. Over time, this sound began to haunt the servants even during their rare hours of rest. Silence was never truly complete for them. Ventilation in the houses was poor, and by morning the upper floors were filled with carbon monoxide. The servants who slept in the attics received the largest dose of toxic substances. They woke up exhausted, with heavy heads and gray faces. Chronic poisoning from combustion products shortened their lives by decades, but no one linked their illnesses to progressive lighting. In the next chapter, you will learn why sleep for servants was not rest, but a brief plunge into cold oblivion. Do you think you could live even a day without electricity with such risks? What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries as a violation of human rights. But back then, it was the norm. Servants' sleeping quarters were traditionally located under the roof or in damp basements. In winter, the temperature in the attics dropped to almost the same as outside. Thin partitions did not retain heat, and gaps in the roof let in the icy wind. The water in the jugs for washing was covered with a crust of ice overnight. The beds were hard pallets with thin, lumpy mattresses. The blankets were worn and prickly, offering no warmth to tired bodies. The servants had to sleep in their clothes, covering themselves with whatever they could find. But even that did not save them from the piercing cold that penetrated to the bone. Chattering teeth prevented them from sleeping during the few hours allotted for rest. In such conditions, it was impossible to fully recover after a hard shift. Sleep was shallow, restless, and brought no relief. People fell into oblivion, only to wake up a few hours later from the cold. Their bodies ached from the hard beds and the dampness that had seeped into the walls. Rheumatism became an occupational disease at a young age. Personal space was non-existent in these rooms. 5 or 6 people could sleep in one room, cramped and stuffy. The smells of unwashed bodies and damp clothes created a heavy atmosphere. The snoring, coughing, or moaning of neighbors made it impossible to relax. Any illness of one person was instantly transmitted to everyone else in the room. The servants had no way to dry their clothes after a day's work. In the morning, they had to put on damp, cold uniforms. The feeling of damp fabric on their skin was their first impression of the new day. Constant dampness led to skin diseases and non-healing ulcers. Clothes never seemed clean or fresh. There was practically no furniture in the rooms, one chair for everyone, and a couple of nails in the wall. There was nowhere to store personal belongings, but there weren't many of them anyway. A small mirror, if there was one, hung in a dark corner. A person couldn't even get a good look at themselves to tidy up. This depersonalization continued during leisure hours. Lighting in the attics was prohibited for fire safety reasons. Servants went to bed and got up in complete, impenetrable darkness. They had to get dressed and find things by touch, by memory. This added to the feeling of helplessness and despondency every morning. The darkness of the attic was as hostile as the darkness of the quarters. They had to get up early, long before dawn, usually at 5 in the morning. Their bodies, exhausted by the cold and lack of sleep, refused to obey. Every awakening required an enormous effort of will. Muscles stiff from the cold had to be stretched before they could move. But there was no time to warm up. Work was waiting. Descending from the attic via steep, narrow staircases was a dangerous adventure. Sleepy people often stumbled in the dark, risking broken legs. There were no railings everywhere, and the steps were often of different heights. Are you ready for the shocking truth that the butler was also a security guard? One of the main duties of senior servants was to guard the family's silver and valuables. At night, all the silverware was locked in a special fortified room or safe. The butler often slept right outside the door of this room, literally guarding it with his body. His sleep was light, attuned to any suspicious sound. In those days, robberies of wealthy homes were common and often ended tragically. Burglars did not hesitate to use force if they encountered resistance. Therefore, night duty was associated with a real risk to life. The servant was the first line of defense, a living shield for his master's property. He always had a heavy club or even an old pistol at hand. Every rustle in the huge house was perceived as an attempted intrusion. Old houses breathed, beams creaked, ventilation whistled, shutters rattled. It was incredibly difficult to distinguish these sounds from the footsteps of an intruder. The guard's nerves were stretched tight all night long. He listened intently to the darkness, trying to decipher the nature of each sound. Checking the locks and bolts was a sacred ritual before bedtime. The butler or senior footman would go around all the doors and windows on the first floor. The windows were often huge, and closing the heavy shutters was physically difficult. A forgotten or poorly closed window was considered a terrible crime. Responsibility for the security of the house rested entirely on the shoulders of the servants. The loneliness of the night watchman in the empty hall was absolute. He sat in an armchair surrounded by shadows, fighting sleep. Reading was not allowed. It was distracting and wasted candles. All that remained was to sit and listen to the silence, populated by the ghosts of the imagination. Time on such nights dragged on endlessly slowly. It was not only living people who caused fear, but also otherworldly forces. The Victorian era was a time when spiritualism and belief in ghosts flourished. Servants, often illiterate and superstitious, sincerely believed in spirits. Any draft or flickering lamp could cause panic and terror, but under no circumstances could they leave their posts. In the event of real danger, the servant had no room for error. He had to raise the alarm, but at the same time not wake his masters unnecessarily. This dilemma created additional psychological pressure. A mistake could cost him his job, and delay could cost lives. The butler often had to sleep on a folding bed in the hallway, which was extremely uncomfortable. Drafts swept across the floor, and no blankets could save him. In the morning, he had to make the bed before the first maids arrived. No traces of the night watch should remain. Protecting the owner's property was considered more important than the servant's own safety. It was believed that a servant should sacrifice himself to save his master's possessions. This idea was instilled over the years and was taken for granted. Loyalty was tested precisely in such moments of danger. In the next chapter, you will learn what happened in the kitchen when the whole house fell asleep. Do you check the front door before going to bed? In Victorian houses, the kitchen was often located in a semi-basement. At night, work was in full swing here, unseen by the inhabitants of the upper floors. The dirtiest and hardest work fell to the kitchen maids. They were the ones who stayed in the kitchen late into the night to wash mountains of dishes. Grease and soot were their constant companions. There was no hot water from the tap. It had to be heated in huge boilers. Fragile girls had to carry heavy buckets of water. The water cooled quickly, and the grease had to be scrubbed off in cold water. This made their hands red, cracked, and constantly sore. The skin on their hands became rough and coarse, like sandpaper. The frying pans and pots of that time were made of cast iron and copper. They were incredibly heavy even when empty, and with food residue, they were impossible to lift. Sand and baking soda were used to clean burnt food. It took hours of scrubbing until the metal began to shine. This monotonous, exhausting work did not require intelligence, but it took all of one's strength. The kitchen floor was paved with stone slabs, which were always cold and slippery. It was easy to slip on spilled grease or water. Falls led to bruises, but the work could not be stopped. Dishwashers often wore wooden shoes to keep their feet dry. The sound of these shoes was the only sound in the kitchen at night. In addition to washing dishes, vegetables had to be prepared for the morning. Potatoes, carrots, and onions were cleaned by the sackful. In the dim candlelight, their eyes grew tired, and the knife often slipped. Cuts on their hands were common, and they healed poorly due to the constant moisture. The juice from the vegetables corroded the wounds, causing a burning sensation. Cockroaches and other insects were the rightful masters of the night kitchen. As soon as it got quiet, they would crawl out of every crack. The fight against them was endless and, in fact, futile. The servants had to carefully hide the food and cover the dishes. The sight of insects scurrying away was a familiar picture. Ventilation in the basements was poor, and the smells of food lingered there forever. The mixture of aromas of grease, dampness, and rotting vegetables created a heavy atmosphere. Breathing this air for 14 to 16 hours a day was harmful to health. The faces of the kitchen workers were pale and unhealthy. Preparation for breakfast began long before dawn. It was necessary to light a huge kitchen stove, which consumed coal by the bucketful. The stove had to be hot by the time the cook arrived. If the fire did not start on time, it could spell disaster. The dishwasher was responsible for this. The loneliness in the kitchen was of a special kind. It was loneliness among dirty dishes. There was no romance or mystery here, only hard work. Thoughts in such an environment became sluggish and joyless. The future seemed as endless as the row of dirty plates. Work in the kitchen was considered the lowest in the hierarchy of servants. These girls were rarely seen upstairs. They lived in their own underground world. Their labor was the foundation on which the glamorous life of the house was built. The secret whispered among servants from generation to generation was a harsh truth. Even in the dead of night, a servant did not belong to themselves. In the cramped servants' quarters, usually in the basement or attic, hung a special system of copper bells. They were connected by long wires to each of the master's bedrooms and living rooms in the huge house. Each bell had its own unique tone and size, and the servant was required to distinguish them by ear, even when half asleep. The ringing of this bell in the middle of the night was a sound that caused an instant and painful rush of adrenaline in the sleeper. It meant that you had to jump out of bed, get dressed in seconds, and run to the call. The reason for such an urgent night call could be anything from a serious problem to a ridiculous trifle. Most often, it was a simple desire to drink a glass of water, a request to fix a rumpled pillow, or to close a window. The owners in their warm beds often did not even think about the fact that they were rudely interrupting the short sleep of a tired person. For them, a servant was simply a convenient mechanism that was required to work around the clock without fail. Sometimes night calls were just a whim of a bored or somniac owner who wanted to talk. But it was physically impossible to ignore this demanding call, as it threatened immediate dismissal. For years, servants slept in a state of constant nervous tension, literally half asleep, panicking that they might miss the signal. This clinging fear prevented them from sinking into the deep, restorative sleep necessary for hard work. Even in rare moments of peace, they imagined the damn bell ringing above their heads. This inevitably led to chronic severe neuroses, nervous tics, and breakdowns. People's psyches were slowly being undermined by the constant state of waiting for a command that could not be missed. The path from the servant's room to the master's bedroom was often long and full of obstacles. It was necessary to run through dark, cold corridors and steep staircases, often by touch without light. Forgetting something in a daze or bringing the wrong item was strictly unacceptable. Breathing was labored from running, but in front of the coveted bedroom door, it was necessary to instantly calm down and catch one's breath. It was customary to enter the master's presence with a completely imperturbable, cheerful, and fresh appearance, as if you had not slept at all. If a servant did not arrive on time or was delayed for a couple of minutes, the master's anger could be truly terrifying. Any delay was perceived by the masters as a personal insult and blatant negligence on the part of the staff. No timid excuses about darkness, cold, or deadly fatigue were taken into account. The servant had to literally materialize out of thin air at the first call. This round-the-clock readiness was an integral part of the unspoken employment contract. Often, such exhausting night shifts fell to the ladies' personal chambermaids or the gentlemen's valets. They had to sit in the cold corridor right outside the master's bedroom door all night long. Sitting for hours on a hard wooden chair, fighting painfully against their eyes closing, was pure torture. They listened intently to the breathing behind the door, ready to enter at the slightest rustle or cough. It was like keeping vigil at the bedside of a seriously ill patient, except that the patient was perfectly healthy and capricious. The bell system was cleverly designed so that the bells continued to swing on their springs for some time after the call. This helped the sleepy servant understand which number had rung if he did not wake up immediately. The sight of this copper tongue swinging in the dead silence caused people to panic. It was a silent and merciless order that could not be disputed or postponed. Sometimes the old bell mechanisms would break or jam, starting to ring on their own from a draft or mice. These were the most frightening and upsetting moments when a breathless servant would rush in, only to find that no one had called him. The owners were terribly angry that they had been awakened by a knock or a light, and the servant was always to blame. Any technical malfunctions in the house were always attributed to the clumsiness and stupidity of the staff. Living in this state of constant anticipation of a call killed all initiative and free will in people. A person gradually turned into an obedient puppet on a string, both literally and figuratively. Their entire life, sleep, and rest were completely subject to the whims of a small copper bell on the wall. In the next chapter, you will learn how laundry turned into a nighttime chemical laboratory, Are you often woken up at night for trivial reasons? Laundry in the Victorian era was not a household chore, but a large-scale and incredibly labor-intensive industrial process. It often began late in the evening, so that the laundry would be clean by morning. Soaking huge mountains of laundry was a mandatory preliminary step that was always done at night. Huge wooden or copper vats were filled with water, and each item had to be sorted by hand. The heavy, stifling smell of dirty laundry mixed with the acrid smell of chemical reagents. It was hard, exhausting physical labor, performed in a damp and poorly ventilated basement. At that time, aggressive lye, soda, and various caustic homemade compounds were used for washing. These chemically active substances mercilessly corroded the skin of the hands, making it red, inflamed, and cracked. The poor women had to work without any protective gloves, immersing their hands up to their elbows in the solution. The caustic fumes of hot alkali constantly irritated the mucous membranes of their noses and eyes, causing tears. Washerwomen often suffered from chronic coughs, asthma, and serious breathing problems because of these chemicals. The water for washing had to be carried in heavy buckets, which put a tremendous strain on the women's backs. Hundreds of liters of water were carried by hand from the well or tapped to the tanks during a single shift. Wet laundry, saturated with water, weighed many times more than dry laundry, and it was very difficult to pull it out of the deep tanks. The muscles of the back and arms constantly ached from overexertion, giving no rest even during sleep. Hernias and organ prolapse were frequent and sad companions of professional laundresses of that era. The process of boiling laundry in huge boilers required constant and vigilant control of the fire and water level. Huge vats of boiling water posed a serious danger in the dim light of the laundry room. It was easy to scald yourself with boiling water or steam on the slippery floor, and qualified medical treatment was unavailable. Thick, hot steam filled the entire room from floor to ceiling, creating a suffocating sauna effect. Visibility in these steam clubs was minimal, which complicated an already difficult job. Sorting laundry required extreme care so as not to accidentally damage delicate and expensive fabrics. Delicate lace and natural silk could not be washed together with coarse linen. In the dim and uncertain light of a candle or kerosene lamp, it was necessary to distinguish between stains and types of fabric. A mistake could cost the laundress a ruined dress belonging to the mistress of the house and a huge fine. This moral responsibility weighed on the workers no less than the physical fatigue of endless washing. Grade fabrics were bleached using dangerous chemicals, including chlorine bleach. The active ingredients were often mixed by eye, which sometimes led to dangerous chemical reactions. Laundry workers were forced to become self-taught chemists, risking their health for the sake of the whiteness of other people's sheets. The risk of serious poisoning from toxic chlorine fumes in a confined space was very real. But the perfect, sparkling whiteness of the master's linen was more important than the health of some laundress. Wet laundry was wrung out by hand or with the help of primitive wooden rollers that were turned by a handle. This activity required considerable physical effort, comparable to weightlifting in a gym. Heavy wet duvet covers and sheets had to be wrung out hundreds of times in a single night. The women's wrists would swell, redden, and lose mobility by morning from the monotonous movements. Hanging the washed laundry out to dry also often took place late at night or early in the morning. Heavy wet sheets had to be lifted high above the head on sticks. The ropes were stretched in special drying rooms under the ceiling or outside in the yard. In winter, wet laundry instantly froze in the cold, becoming hard and sharp as a board. Removing such icy shields was a separate challenge for frozen fingers. The work of a laundress was an endless, enclosed cycle, soaking, boiling, washing, and wringing. All the dirt from the luxurious manor house passed through their hard-working hands every day. They saw the unsightly underside of the luxurious life of the aristocrats in the truest sense of the word. And this underside did not smell of perfume, but of acrid sweat, lye, and eternal dampness. The laundry room was a terrible place where the health and beauty of a young woman literally burned away in just a few years. Constant dampness, heavy loads, and toxic chemicals quickly did their dirty work. By the age of 30, a laundress usually looked like an emaciated, sick old woman with crippled hands. A special and extremely difficult role in the nightlife of a large house was assigned to footmen and personal chambermaids. They were doomed to wait endlessly for their masters to return from lavish balls and receptions. The social life of the Victorian aristocracy was incredibly active and often lasted until dawn. According to strict rules of etiquette, servants were not allowed to go to bed until their master had returned home and gone to bed. They sat in cold hallways or cramped cloakrooms, fully dressed in uniform and ready to work at a moment's notice. These night hours of forced idleness dragged on unbearably long and painfully for them. It was strictly forbidden to read books, knit, or engage in any personal activities to pass the time. They had to be alert, sit up straight, and listen to the silence of the house, waiting for the sound of wheels. Any attempt to occupy themselves could be interpreted by the manager as disrespect for their duties and laziness. Sleep was the main and most terrible enemy, which had to be fought for hours alone. Servants walked around the room in circles, stood by the icy window, pinched themselves. They did anything to stay awake. Their eyes were heavy with fatigue, and their bodies desperately demanded a horizontal position. When the long-awaited carriage finally pulled up to the house, the servant had to instantly shake off his sleepiness and numbness. He had to greet his tired masters with an invariably cheerful and fresh appearance, as if it were noon rather than 3 in the morning. His face had to express cordiality and readiness to serve, hiding his deadly fatigue. Helping with undressing was a complex and delicate ritual, especially for ladies in evening gowns. Stiff corsets, voluminous crinolines, and countless small hooks and buttons required the dexterity of a jeweler's fingers. The maid's tired and frozen fingers did not obey her well, but she could not make mistakes or hesitate so as not to irritate her mistress. One awkward movement could tear expensive fabric or cause pain to her mistress. Immediately after undressing, the mistress's clothes and shoes had to be put in perfect order. Luxurious dresses had to be carefully examined for accidental tears, torn beads, and wine stains. If minor repairs were needed, they were done immediately without going to bed by dim candlelight. Cleaning shoes of street dirt and rubbing them with wax also fell on the shoulders of the sleepy servant. The working day only really ended when all the items had been cleaned and put away in the wardrobes. Very often, the owners returned from parties in a frankly bad mood or intoxicated. The servants had to meekly endure drunken whims, rudeness, and completely unfounded nitpicking. Silence and complete obedience were the only available protection from the master's wrath. Any word spoken out of turn could provoke a fit of rage and lead to dismissal without recommendation. Psychologically, it was very difficult to endure night after night, feeling like a powerless object. In the morning, despite the critically late bedtime, the servant was obliged to get up before his master to prepare the house for awakening. There were only a few hours left for sleep, sometimes a miserable 2 or 3 hours. This cruel regime of chronic sleep deprivation exhausted the young people's bodies very quickly. People lived for years in a state of constant jet lag, no longer understanding whether it was daytime or the middle of the night. Personal chambermaids often became unwitting and silent witnesses to the darkest family secrets and dramas. The master's frank conversations at night, drunken tears, and marital quarrels all took place right before their eyes. They had to keep these dirty secrets sacred, pretending that they had seen and heard nothing. This moral burden of other people's secrets also weighed on their psyche, creating a feeling of complicity. Servants were often not even provided with a special warm room for their nightly vigil. They had to sit in cool corridors or in the draft by the front door. Severe colds and bronchitis were common, but there was no time to get sick and no money for treatment. They had to suppress their painful coughs with all their might so that the sounds would not annoy their masters. Sometimes this agonizing wait turned out to be completely in vain, as the masters might suddenly decide to stay overnight with their guests. But none of the masters thought it necessary to warn the servants in advance or send a message. They could sit all night in a hard chair, staring meaninglessly at the closed door until dawn. And in the morning, the usual working day began, without any concessions for a sleepless night. This work required complete self-denial and renunciation of one's own self. The servant's personal life virtually ceased to exist, completely dissolving into the life and whims of the master. They were insubstantial shadows that waited obediently in the darkness to be summoned. Moving around the huge house at night posed many real physical dangers for the staff. The servants' staircases, hidden in the walls, were deliberately made steep, narrow, and often had no railings to save space. The stone or wooden steps were badly worn from time and constant use, becoming smooth and slippery. In complete darkness, often with hands occupied with heavy loads, one wrong step inevitably led to a fall. Severe broken limbs and dislocations were common, but people tried not to talk about them so as not to lose their jobs. The parquet floors in the reception rooms and corridors were waxed to a mirror shine, making them resemble an ice rink. The slippery leather soles of the servants' cheap shoes provided no reliable grip on the surface. Servants were forced to balance heavy trays full of dishes, risking falling and breaking everything. Falling with a tray threatened not only painful bruises, but also a huge fine for breaking porcelain. Every step required extreme concentration, like walking on a tightrope. Low doorways and protruding beams in cramped service rooms were the cause of constant head injuries. In the dark, it was very easy to misjudge the height of the ceiling and hit your head on the hard wood. Bruises, abrasions, and bumps on the forehead were a common professional adornment for many servants. Severe headaches or dizziness after a blow were never a reason for exemption from work. The sharp corners of heavy oak furniture and wrought iron chests in narrow corridors left black bruises on the legs and hips. Servants constantly bumped into obstacles in their haste, which were simply invisible in the dark. Their bodies were covered with abrasions that did not have time to heal due to constant new blows. The ability to maneuver in a confined space with a load in your hands was a real art of survival. Carrying heavy loads in complete darkness put enormous strain on the spine and joints. Coal for fireplaces, water in buckets, furniture. All of this had to be carried by hand from floor to floor. Without being able to see where you were putting your feet on the stairs, it was very easy to slip and injure your back permanently. Almost all servants suffered from chronic, debilitating lower back pain by the age of 30. The tools they had to work with at night also posed a serious danger. Sharp kitchen knives, heavy hot irons, sewing needles. All of these became weapons in conditions of poor visibility. Deep cuts and burns were a regular occurrence, and unsanitary conditions exacerbated the situation. Wound treatment was primitive, so the risk of inflammation and blood poisoning was always high. The lack of electric lighting meant that any accidental obstacles on the floor were virtually invisible. A brush, bucket of water, or rag left by someone could cause serious injury and falls. Servants learned to memorize the location of all objects, creating a mental map of the house in their heads. But things had a sneaky way of being moved by other people. Accumulated fatigue greatly dulled reactions and attention by the end of a long shift. By the end of the night, coordination was impaired, and people began to stumble on level ground. Servants became clumsy not of their own volition, but because of the exhaustion of their nervous system. This greatly increased the risk of accidents, especially in the darkest hours before dawn. However, the fear of injury and loss of working capacity was stronger than any physical pain. A disabled servant was of no use to anyone, was immediately dismissed, and found himself on the street without a means of subsistence. Therefore, they silently endured the pain and continued to work, limping or tightly bandaging their bloody hands. Survival depended directly on the ability to stand on one's feet and carry out orders. The house, which seemed safe, cozy, and beautiful in the sunlight during the day, turned into a dangerous obstacle course at night. Every dark corner, every worn step posed a hidden threat to health, And every night, they had to navigate this deadly route, risking their lives for the comfort of others. Here is an expanded version of the 10th and final chapter. I kept the structure and the final conclusion, removed the lists in parentheses, and increased the volume of the text, adding psychological detail and details of the morning routine. The text is broken down into easy-to-read paragraphs, each with no more than 6 sentences. The blurred line between the dead of night and early morning was practically erased for an ordinary servant. At a time when a new day was just beginning for the owners of the house, for the staff it was only the middle of an endless shift. The cold gray dawn outside the window brought no relief, only new difficult tasks. The heavy wooden shutters had to be opened silently, the ashes cleaned out, and the fireplaces in all the rooms relit. The transition from the silence of night to the frantic bustle of day was abrupt, relentless, and inevitable. The servants' own breakfast was always quick, meager, and often eaten on the run. Sticky oatmeal, a piece of stale bread, and very weak tea. That was all the fuel they had for their hard physical labor. There was almost never any time to sit quietly at the table and talk. The food was often already cold, as everything hot and fresh was supposed to be served upstairs to the masters. A dull feeling of constant hunger was a familiar and unchanging backdrop to life for most workers. At the same time, the appearance of a servant early in the morning had to be absolutely impeccable and neat. No traces of a sleepless night, red eyes, wrinkled clothes, or dirty hands were allowed. They had to manage to get themselves into perfect order in a matter of minutes, washing with ice-cold water. Neatness and freshness were an integral part of strict professional ethics, despite deadly fatigue. The slightest stain on an apron could result in a serious fine. With the first ray of sunlight, a new daytime cycle of cleaning the huge house began. Dust that was impossible to see by candlelight at night now had to be removed immediately and thoroughly. The owners could come down for breakfast at any moment, and all surfaces had to shine with cleanliness. The house required constant, continuous care, as if it were a living and capricious organism. The servants polished the silver and scrubbed the floors over and over again, erasing the traces of the previous day. Psychologically, the morning was the hardest part of the day because of the realization of a simple truth. The servant understood that he still had a long day of exhausting work ahead of him without a break. The hope of a short rest was postponed until late in the evening, which now seemed unattainably distant. The days merged into one continuous gray streak, completely devoid of personal events and joys. The complete absence of weekends and holidays only exacerbated this painful feeling of hopelessness. The servants often envied their masters, who could afford to sleep until lunchtime. This striking contrast between their hard labor and the idleness of their masters in the morning was particularly stark. While some basked in warm silk sheets, others were literally falling off their feet from exhaustion. The social gap between the floors at these hours was almost physically palpable. Hatred and envy mingled with resignation. The morning hours were the busiest and most hectic time in the whole house. Endless ringing of bells, urgent errands, delivery of the morning mail, and preparation of clothes for going out. The house was finally waking up and demanding increased attention from all sides at once. Servants rushed between floors on the stairs, carrying out dozens of small but important errands. It was impossible to stop, as this would disrupt the rhythm of their masters' lives. Despite the tremendous fatigue and pain in their legs, they had to smile sincerely and be respectful. A bad mood, a sullen look, or an insufficiently low bow could result in a severe reprimand. An artificial emotional mask became firmly attached to the face, reliably hiding a person's real feelings and thoughts. The servant learned to hide his personality and character deep inside, leaving only his function on the outside. And then when the sun finally rose completely above the horizon, the servant realized that he had survived another night. But this realization did not bring any particular joy, because the next night would inevitably come. It was a huge wheel from which it was impossible to jump out of at will. Life here was measured not by years lived, but by endless changes of dirty laundry and buckets of coal. The history of the nightlife of servants is a history of a great but completely invisible feat. It was a feat of endless patience, superhuman endurance, and forced humility. Today we admire the luxurious Victorian interiors and the glamour of that era. But we often forget the terrible price paid in human health to create this impeccable comfort. Now you can see what was hidden behind the beautiful facades of Victorian mansions. Night was not a time of rest, it was a time of hard labor, fear, and danger. The comfort of the aristocracy was paid for with the health and sleep of hundreds of thousands of invisible people. Their lives burned like cheap candles, lighting the way for others. What would you have done in the place of a Victorian servant? Accepted your fate or tried to escape, risking death from starvation? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new dives into the dark corners of history that aren't written about in textbooks.